Hi, all. I'm here to briefly introduce Brent Rinaldi. He is the editor of the Thoreau Society Bulletin. So you have it in your mailbox regularly. This is the man behind the production, and he's going to tell us about the water cure.
Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, everyone, for being here. All right. So the organizers call this a special talk. And in fact, it's a two-for-one. We'll be seeking to unravel a historical mystery, and we'll learn something about health and medicine in Thoreau's time. So let's start with the mystery. A few years ago, when I was writing an article on Thoreau's laundry habits, I encountered this description of Thoreau by one Celia P.R. Frease, suggesting that based on his unkempt appearance, it looked like Thoreau was a man who did his own laundry. These few sentences were part of a longer description of an encounter between Frease and Thoreau from a memoir written by Frease. The excerpt is reproduced in Walter Harding's book, Thoreau as Seen by His Contemporaries. One would like to know something about Frease herself and about the meeting, like when and where it happened. Harding tells us very little beyond that Frease was from Ohio and that she was one of the first women in the nation to earn a medical degree, which makes this meeting all the more intriguing. It turns out that Harding is so sparse with information because he never saw the memoir itself. His source was a 1969 news item from the Cincinnati Post reporting the discovery of the memoir. The news report provided a few excerpts, and that is what Harding reproduced in his book. With a little digging, I was able to track down the memoir to the Cincinnati Public Library. I tracked on the memoir to the Cincinnati Public Library, and the staff there graciously provided a digitized copy. So we have in our hands now what is effectively a brand new primary source in Thoreau studies. The memoir is a 22-page typescript dated 1902. Frease spends about a page and a half on a joint portrait of Thoreau and his friend George William Curtis. Most of what she has to say about Thoreau is her impression of the man himself. Here are some of the juiciest bits. These bits are all found in Harding's book. Now that we have the memoir, we have more information about Frease herself and more clues about how and when she would have met Thoreau. So here's the thumbnail overview of what we know about Celia Frease herself. She was born as Cecilia Pumpelly Ricker in Claremont County, Ohio in 1830. So she was 13 years younger than Thoreau. A formative influence on Celia was her learning in 1849 that America had trained its first female medical doctor, Elizabeth Blackwell, who earned her MD from a college in Geneva, New York. Celia set her heart on studying medicine as well. After an unsuccessful petition to be the first woman enrolled at a medical school in nearby Cincinnati, Celia moved to New York City at age 22 to study hydropathy, that is, water therapy, with Dr. Russell Trawl. Trawl's New York Hydropathic Institute was not yet a degree-granting institution, but it did provide Celia with an opportunity to attend lectures on medical subjects and to get a practical education in hydropathy, a subject that we will discuss in more detail presently. By the time Celia had completed her year and a half of study with Dr. Trawl, the Eclectic Medical Institute of Cincinnati had opened its doors to women, so she enrolled there next. In her year and a half in Cincinnati, she earned her MD, and she also got married to a fellow student named Hiram Frease from Pennsylvania. Hiram and his brother Solomon were also trained hydropaths. In 1855, Solomon and Hiram and Celia, all three with hydropathic training and proper medical degrees, opened up a practice together just outside Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh Water Cure. The three of them operated the Pittsburgh Water Cure for about 7 years until 1862. At the clinic, Celia specialized in women's health. The clinic boasted a clientele hailing from practically every state in the Union. In 1862, for reasons that Celia's memoir does not explain, Hiram and Celia gave up the practice of medicine. They retired to Ohio, where they lived out the rest of their long lives. Celia died in 1914, over 5 decades after retiring from medicine. So Celia spent 10 years studying and practicing medicine and then another 50 years in retirement. The memoir is essentially a recounting of stories and impressions from the glory days of her youth, especially the time she spent at Dr. Charles' Hydropathic Institute. We can imagine that the memoir might have been a putting down on paper of stories she had often told to entertain friends and relations. Celia comes across in the memoir, interestingly, as a very Thoreauvian figure. She loves the outdoors. She defends simple housekeeping with tin over extravagant housekeeping with crystal and china. So now we can try to figure out where and when Celia Frease and Henry Thoreau met. The where is the easier question. We can presume that it must have been in or around New York. The main focus of Celia's memoir is the time she spent in New York City, and Henry is not known to have visited any other place where Celia ever lived or studied or even visited. So assuming New York is where Celia and Henry met, the next step is to compare their timelines and figure out when they were in New York together. So here's a list of all the known visits Thoreau made to New York and environs. There are 7 of them. Celia Freese's period of studying with Dr. Trawl in Manhattan began in the spring or summer of 1852 and lasted until the fall of 1853. If we compare the 2 timelines, we see that there could have been some overlap. The trip that Thoreau made to New York City to sell pencils after the commercial failure of A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers took place sometime between 1849, when the book was published, and November 1853, when he briefly mentions in his journal that he had once made such a trip. But there's a problem with this scenario. In the 1853 journal entry, Thoreau describes the trip to sell pencils in terms that make it sound like it took place some time ago, that it was not recent. Furthermore, Thoreau's journal becomes very detailed from November 1850 onward. If he had made the trip to sell pencils after November 1850, it should have left some trace in the journal, and there is no trace. So for these reasons, it's most likely that the trip to New York City to sell pencils, mentioned obliquely in 1853, took place earlier in our window of possibility, sometime before November 1850. And in that case, he would have missed Celia. So this seems like a dead end, but in fact, there's another avenue to explore. Celia describes in her memoir some events that took place at Dr. Charles Institute in Manhattan at a later date. In her words, some years after I had graduated. Her husband Hiram was with her at Dr. Charles on this second occasion. Although Celia does not tell us when this second trip to New York City happened, we can pinpoint the time frame. Celia mentions befriending Miss Marie Zakshevska on this visit, while Miss Zak, as Celia called her, was enrolled in a course in hydropathy at Dr. Charles Institute. Now, Marie Zakshevska is an important figure in the history of American medicine. She began her career as a nurse in her native Prussia and then came to the New World to seek better opportunities. After a year working in the German quarter of New York's Garment District, she finally managed to meet Elizabeth Blackwell, who you will recall was the nation's first credentialed female physician. Blackwell took Zakshevska under her wing and helped her obtain English language proficiency and the credentials she needed to practice medicine in this country. Zakshevska obtained her MD in Cincinnati, and then along with Blackwell, she founded an all-female teaching hospital in New York. Subsequently, she moved to Boston, where she founded and led the New England Hospital for Women and Children. Zakshevska's biographers do not tell us when she was studying hydropathy with Dr. Trawl, but we can figure that the only block of time when she would have been in New York and at leisure to be dabbling in hydropathy would have been after her earning her MD and before opening up the New York Teaching Hospital. That window is about 14 months, starting in March of 1856. When we combine that with Celia's statement that she and Hiram were staying at Dr. Trawl's in the wintertime, that narrows the window for Celia and Hiram to have befriended Miss Zak at Dr. Trawl's to the winter of 1856 to 57. If we plug that into our timeline, we see that this window is quite promising. Thoreau was in town that same winter. Specifically, he was in the Mid-Atlantic region for several weeks doing a surveying job in Eagleswood, New Jersey, and occasionally making trips into New York City to socialize. This was the trip during which Bronson Alcott famously introduced Thoreau to Walt Whitman. So now we want to look for corroborating evidence, anything that would tell us that on this trip, Thoreau could have met Celia. In fact, we have 3 bits of evidence that point to this trip and this time frame as indeed being the occasion of the meeting. First, we have evidence about Thoreau's itinerary from the journal of Bronson Alcott. Alcott was living in New York City at this time, seeking opportunities to earn money for his family. Alcott had taken up lodgings at Dr. Trall's Hydropathic Institute, where he was provided with room and board by Dr. Trall in exchange for leading a series of evening conversations. We learn from Alcott's journal that Thoreau joined him at Dr. Trall's Institute for at least one evening on November 7. Thoreau could very well have encountered Celia that evening in the central dining hall. We need to understand that the Institute was not only a teaching institution and a medical establishment, but also a boarding house. One contemporary visitor describes it as a first-class boarding house that serves both hotel fare and vegetable fare, which Thoreau would certainly have appreciated. The clientele included a broad swath of humanity, and among them were some of the famous and fashionable. Celia's memoir describes encounters with Horace Greeley, Charles Dana, William Lloyd Garrison, Lucy Stone, Lucretia Mott, Henry Ward Beecher, and Edward Everett Hale as a result of her association with Dr. Trall. And the implication is that most or all of those meetings happened at the Hydropathic Institute. The meeting with Thoreau could have been one more of these celebrity encounters at Dr. Trall's. The second bit of evidence concerns George William Curtis. Celia Freese's memoir links Thoreau and Curtis together in a way that makes it clear she met the two men on the same occasion. Curtis lived and worked in New York City. From Curtis's correspondence, which is housed at Harvard's Houghton Library, we don't find any direct evidence that Curtis visited Trall's Institute around this time. But we do find that in late October, Curtis made a week-long trip to South Jersey. This could have been a visit to Eagleswood, near Perth Amboy in southern New Jersey. And if it was, the timing would have been exactly right to be with Thoreau during his first weekend on site, which was spent socializing before the surveying began on Monday. Thoreau does write to his sister Sophia that there were one or two familiar faces present in Eagleswood on that first weekend. And if we allow that Curtis could have been there, we could also entertain the possibility that Celia and Hiram visited Eagleswood that same weekend. We do know that Eagleswood was a destination that attracted a lot of visitors and that there was a lot of traffic back and forth from New York City. It is entirely within the realm of possibility that Celia could have visited Eagleswood and made the acquaintance of Thoreau and Curtis together there. That's admittedly tenuous, but now we come to our third bit of evidence. One of the colorful characters that Thoreau met at Eagleswood that first weekend was Edward Palmer, whom Thoreau describes in his letter to Sophia as the anti-money man. Palmer was the author of an 1839 manifesto titled An Address on the Origin and Evil Influences of Money, which advocated a return to the barter system. What is curious is that when Celia remembers her meeting with Henry David Thoreau in the memoir, she writes this of Thoreau: "He thought there should be no money, that people should exchange labor when they wanted anything." This is not an opinion that is characteristic of Thoreau as we know him, but in light of Thoreau's mention of Palmer at Eagleswood, a couple of possible explanations offer themselves for Celia's strange characterization of Henry. Perhaps Celia was present in Eagleswood on that fateful weekend and met Thoreau and Curtis there, and also heard Palmer's opinion about money, and later misremembered that opinion as belonging to Thoreau. Or perhaps she heard Thoreau participating in a conversation with Palmer and others, in which Thoreau, in defense of Palmer against skeptics, gave a memorable account of his own Walden Pond experiment to illustrate the possibility of living well at the margins of the money economy. Or perhaps Celia had met Thoreau and Curtis not at Eagleswood on that first weekend, but later at Dr. Trall's, and the encounter with Palmer at Eagleswood had so captured Thoreau's imagination that he was going around repeating Palmer's doctrine about money as a provocation when he met new people over the following weeks in New York. So we can't confirm exactly when and where Celia and Henry met, but it was almost certainly in New York or New Jersey during Thoreau's 1856 trip. Exploring the circumstances around this meeting fleshes out the Eagleswood surveying trip a little more for us. It highlights the significance of Thoreau's lifelong friendship with Curtis, and it shows us Thoreau as a successful author and even something of a celebrity interacting with the public. Celia reports that when she met Thoreau, he gave her a copy of his book. She doesn't say which book it was. On balance, it was probably A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. We know that Thoreau brought spare copies of A Week with him on this trip to give away, because we know that he gave one to Walt Whitman. All right, so now let's shift gears a little and talk about the popular movement in alternative medicine around which the story we've been telling revolves, hydropathy. Water had been recognized as a healing modality since ancient times. The modern hydropathic movement originated in Central Europe in the early 19th century when Vincenz Priesnitz, a Silesian peasant, self-administered some water treatments after a serious injury and found they produced remarkable results. Priesnitz opened a bustling facility in Greifenberg in the 1820s, and his doctrines spread around Europe and the Americas. Central figures of the movement in the US included Dr. Joel Schuh, who opened the nation's first water cure facility in Lower Manhattan in 1843, and Mary Gove Nichols, a writer and speaker on women's health, who organized the very first formal courses on hydropathy in the US, and of course the energetic Dr. Russell Trawl, who took over the editorship of the Water Cure Journal from Dr. Schuh and whose water cure facility on Manhattan's west side became central to the movement, as it is central to our story as well. In America, hydropathy was one of several alternative therapy movements that were competing with regular medicine and with each other. Regular medicine in the early and mid-19th century, before germ theory, was grounded in the ancient theory of 4 bodily humors. Common treatments intended to bring the humors into balance included bloodletting and administering poisons like mercury and arsenic to induce vomiting and purging. Regular medicine was unpleasant, and it was widely understood to be dangerous and ineffective. And to add insult to the injury, it was expensive, and in rural areas it was often inaccessible. So there was a strong demand for alternatives. In fact, hydropathy was just one of a crowded field of alternatives to regular medicine. There was also homeopathy, also imported from Europe, and a US-based botanical movement that sought to discover and systematize herbal and other natural remedies to replace the poisons used in regular medicine. And there were other new treatment modalities based on magnetism and electricity and hypnotism. There we are, caught up to my slides. This rainbow assortment of medical options was part of Thoreau's world, and we find allusions to it in his writing. He writes in Walden, for example, about village gossip being healthy in homeopathic doses. And also in Walden, he writes about restoring mankind by botanic and magnetic means. All right, so let's talk about hydropathy. In contrast to recreational warm water spas, hydropathy relied on cold water as a treatment modality. A variety of cold showers and baths were prescribed, as illustrated here, sometimes supplemented by massage. Patients were wrapped in cold, wet towels for lengths of time. And of course, patients were expected to drink cold water, and lots of it. Some of the images I'm showing are from hydropathy manuals. Others are obviously satirical. The primary beneficial effect of bracing cold water was thought to be its stimulation of the body to heal and strengthen itself. Hydropaths taught that health was the body's natural state, and that the job of the enlightened physician was not to wage war on the body, but to nurse the body's regenerative strength. They emphasized prevention over cure, and they encouraged self-treatment at home. They considered that whereas regular physicians made a business model out of dependency, they wanted to empower ordinary people to look after their own health so that eventually the populace would have no more need of their own or any other professional physician's services. So hydropathy was about therapeutic uses of water, but it was also about healthy lifestyle, what was then termed hygienic living. In the American context, it quickly absorbed into itself a variety of other allied reform causes. At the top of the list was temperance and dietary reform, drawing on the work and teachings of men such as Sylvester Graham and William A. Alcott, the first cousin of Bronson Alcott. Patients were instructed to refrain from tobacco, alcohol, and spicy foods, and they were encouraged to give up meat. Vigorous physical exercise was encouraged, along with proper rest. Hydropaths also embraced dress reform. They condemned women's fashions that constricted the body. In other ways as well, hydropathy was oriented towards elevating women and supporting their fight for rights. Hydropathy depathologized menstruation and pregnancy and childbirth, and it actively encouraged women to take leadership roles in practicing and teaching medicine. Among the transcendentalists, Margaret Fuller was one who heartily endorsed hydropathy. The praises of cold water seemed to her an excellent sign of the age. We can see that as a movement, hydropathy was in tune with the spirit of the times that produced Fourierism and transcendentalism of the Brook Farm and Fruitlands variety, and that produced the techno-utopianism of John Adolphus Etzler, which Thoreau critiqued, and that produced Palmer's anti-money reforms, and 1,000 other reforms. The spirit of the times was progressive and unabashedly optimistic about the future. Adherents believed that society could be perfected, and soon, within their own lifetimes, on a cooperative, voluntary basis. A strident optimism of this kind permeates the Water Cure Journal. We can see why Thoreau might have been attracted by the water cure movement. He himself preferred an austere glass of cold water to any other beverage, and he readily took a polar bear plunge into Walden Pond in winter. And we can also see how he might have been repulsed by it, as he stayed aloof from Brook Farm and critiqued Etzler's techno-utopianism. In fact, it was the latter instinct that won out in the case of hydropathy. Thoreau was as bitingly skeptical of hydropathy as he was of every other school and sect. We know this not from any record he left of his stay at Dr. Trall's establishment, but from an episode during his later years. As Thoreau's health deteriorated, his friend Daniel Ricketson urged him to accept a consultation from Ricketson's own trusted hydropathic physician, Dr. Edward E. Denniston of Northampton. Ricketson personally made the trip from New Bedford to accompany Dr. Denniston on his house call in Concord. Ricketson recorded in his journal that Dr. Denniston was unable to awaken in Thoreau an interest in his mode of treating diseases by the water practice. Ricketson did not press the matter any further. On the contrary, he indulged Thoreau by distancing himself from Dr. Denniston, writing to Thoreau that he was very much pleased at the unceremonious way in which you described him after the consultation. The 1850s were the high watermark for the hydropathy movement in the US. A number of factors contributed to its subsequent decline. One was that, unlike homeopathy, for example, hydropathy never professionalized. In the spirit of encouraging home care and self-care, the movement's leaders refrained from establishing credentialing requirements. Another factor was that when germ theory put regular medicine on a solid scientific footing in the late 19th century, irregulars like the hydropaths lost their greatest marketing advantage, the public's dissatisfaction with the old standard regimen of bleeding and purging. Culturally, as hydropathy in the US had ridden the wave of earnest, cooperative, utopian reform energy in the early 19th century, it, like Fourierism and the rest, fell out of sync with the zeitgeist, which in the post-Civil War era was now cynical, grasping, and individualistic. During Celia Freese's half-century of retirement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, those water cures that remained viable businesses evolved into spas. In this image, we see Dr. Trall's former flagship facility in Manhattan, where Celia had learned her trade and spent her most memorable days, and which might have been the place where she met Henry David Thoreau, converted in the 1870s into a recreational warm water Turkish bath. And during the same period, the doctrines of hydropathy devolved into the more modest claims of what we know today as hydrotherapy. Thank you. And we have a few minutes, so if there are questions.
Thank you, Brent. I have a question. I've seen illustrations of the, and your one slide showed it, electric hydrotherapy. And I've seen illustrations of people being submerged in tanks with wires being attached. Could you comment some on the role of electricity?
Not enough to tell any good stories, but I'm aware that, and in fact, the Solomon and Hiram and Celia, one of their advertisements, you can see the evolution of their you can see the evolution of their practice over the course of their 7 years, but the advertisements they put in the Water Cure Journal, and one of those advertisements says, we've got the latest technology now. We've got electric therapy to add to our hydrotherapy. I don't know the details of how it worked, but it must have been fascinating.
Thanks. I really enjoyed this. And for anybody who's continuing interest in water cure, I'll be talking about the Wesselhoft establishment in Brattleboro, which just brings me to an interesting, I guess you would say, range, because Wesselhoft was, don't try this at home. You cannot do hydrotherapy at home. Okay. And he goes on in some of his pamphlets. Now, of course, that was a great business thing for him because, he'd lose his clients. But I also just wonder about now the regional differences. And also I would love to hear more because, again, Wesselhoft goes on about the wonders of the Brattleboro waters. And, does the chemical composition, has a chemist who comes and does the whole thing about, what's in the water. And so what was in the New York City waters? I mean, do they mention that in their, specifications?
That's a great question. So in principle, hydropathy was something that could be practiced with any water of any quality, any place. But I'm sure that many facilities advertise the particular good qualities of their water. That's why you should visit their facility. The Brattleboro facility is interesting. In my research, I tried to see, because Thoreau, he went to Brattleboro, he spent some time there. Did he connect with the water cure facility there? I haven't found any evidence that he did. Yeah, so I'm sure that many local facilities would have touted the quality of their particular water.
Yeah, and just one other follow-up and then I'll leave it. But it's also interesting that Mary Gove Nichols trained at Wesselhoff's establishment in Brattleboro.
Yes.
So there's that connection, but then it
Yeah.
seems like people would just take it in their own directions.
Yes, and I can say in terms of regionalism, so New York City was the center of the movement, but it spread throughout the U.S. Mostly, it was most popular in New England and the Midwest. And Tom Potter and I were talking about this earlier this morning. There's something about cold water as a treatment modality. There's a little bit of suffering involved there, and so it might be something that appeals to the Yankee spirit.
Well, thank you, first of all, Brent, for this is truly inspiring original research, bringing something truly new to light. I have a general question, or if you'd like to comment. My thoughts went to Thoreau's friendship with Harry Blake in Worcester, and the group that it's well known that in time Blake would congregate almost like a spontaneous salon on the occasion of Thoreau's letters arriving, the long ones, the philosophical, spiritual ones. And if my recall is correct, among that was of course not a firm group, but among them was Theo Brown, the tailor, and so the close friend. He was probably the most constant. But there was also Abby Kelly Foster, the radical feminist and abolitionist, also lived in Worcester with her husband. And also Dr. Seth Rogers, who was a prominent water cure doctrine that I think it was called he was the leader of the Worcester Hydropathic Institute or something to that effect. And I seem to recall that Rogers is also mentioned maybe just in passing in Thoreau's journals, but I'm thinking it might be a context to explore if you haven't already. Yeah, thanks.
Well, yeah, that's a great comment, and that's another connection that I was aware. And as you were talking, I'm thinking, what's the name of the hydropath in Worcester? So Seth Rogers, thank you. So far I haven't found any connection between Thoreau and the circle in Worcester that has anything substantial connection to Seth Rogers' practice of hydropathic medicine. But it was definitely, it was there. This was part of the culture at the time. Yeah.
I got you right
back. That was just so entertaining. And I really want to hear about how you did the research, but we'll save that. I'm interested in this flirting with the prurience of the naked body, that this was a way to show naked bodies. And I'm wondering, did you come across anything where they talked about appropriate steps to ensure modesty and so on?
That's a great question. Well, there was a lot of being wrapped in towels, so that's part of the modesty. We know that a practice like the Freeses would have had both men and women on staff. So as far as treatment goes, the part of the program of modesty might have included, being treated by somebody of the same gender. A step removed from your question, to one interesting point that didn't make it into the talk is that as part of the program of avoiding alcohol, avoiding tobacco, avoiding spicy foods, avoiding meat if you're willing to go that far. Another step in the program was, well, avoid sexual activity. And that was actually something that was, well, this is a whole separate thing, but Mary Gove Nichols, she was drummed out of the movement because she and her husband published a textbook that had, detailed pictures of the human anatomy and a frank discussion of sexuality. And for many in the hydropathic community, that was a step too far. And in fact, then they went to live in a commune of anarchists on Long Island, and the anarchists thought they went too far as well.
I'm thinking of Jane Austen's Persuasion, and there is no American novel set at a water cure establishment, is there? Does anybody know?
Sorry, Ted and back.
It's more of just a comment, Brent. One of the things, I had a friend who was suffering with the sciatica, had back problems, went into New York City, got all kinds of advice. And at the end of all this advice by this high-ranking, well-paid professional, was told to go home and take warm baths with Epsom salt. And personally, I realize I am a fan of Epsom salt. So if you have any of these things, you can save yourself the trip to New York and buy a $5 thing from CVS and use it in your own tub.
There's still a role for health, for self-care. Yes. All right.